Hi, my name is Fonnesbech. I'm narrative director and head of IP development in 2 different companies. And I'm here to talk about making IPs that last. And very specifically talking about not just making games, but actually making IPs. So the way I like to start is with a picture like this, which is, I think, the way most game developers feel in the middle of the night, a little bit after they've started developing their game, or in the middle of developing their game, or actually probably most of the time. So what happens for game developers is that we usually start by working with pure passion, and we just want to make the game we want to make. And then one night, staring at the ceiling, we realize that no matter how much we love this game, the laws of business are still going to apply when it goes out into the world. And that's a tough moment, because no matter how much you love it, it still has to survive out there with all the thousands of other games coming out every month and every year. So the next thought after that is often I want what the AAAs have, which is basically I want some predictability in my life. I want to just have an idea of a percentage chance of how well this game will do, so that it isn't totally make or break, but we know more or less how many developers or fans we're going to get. And that brings us to this, which is, what is it the AAAs have that the indies don't? Well, what the AAAs have is IP. So we all know Hitman, I assume. This is a Danish developer based here in Copenhagen, where I am. And for 20 years, they've built a company with over 100 employees around this single series of games, the Hitman. They've made other games as well, but they always return to the Hitman. And when they actually sold the company to Square Enix, the thing that really makes an impression is how much of the value of the company was actually in the character of the Hitman. So we're not talking about the technology or the talent or the buildings or the office equipment or the servers or any of that, but just in signing over the rights to using the Hitman character. And the answer to the question is it was 60% of the company value, or actually it was more. And that just shows you building an IP, building a recognizable character, being able to own it, and building love for that is actually a big part of what it is to survive as a game developer. And there is a tendency, of course, to look at the story and the characters as just fluff you sprinkle on top of all the technology and the gameplay and all the things that really matter. But what I'm here to tell you is that the IP and also the brand is actually the core of your business. I'm not saying it's the thing that you should spend most of your time on, but if you're not dedicating a significant amount of your time and resources to building an IP and also to building a brand, the chances of your company surviving are actually not very high at all. And the investors know this, and the publishers know this. But us indies, we often don't. So what I'm really asking is, don't treat the brand as somebody else's problem, and don't treat your world, your character, and your stories as if it was just fluff. So what I'm going to do here for the next 25 minutes is that I'm going to go through these 3 things. First, IPs and brands, what the hell is the difference? Also a little bit about who I am. Then I'm going to go into a little bit about building a brand, and then into how to develop a lasting IP. So a little bit about me. I started out playing role-playing games and having home computers and so on. I had the Amiga, I had Commodore 64. I went into business bootstrapping, so I made my own company. I made game projects for learning and advertising and all kinds of things. And then with Cloud Chamber, I really got the chance to make a dream project, which was kind of a found footage mystery with Hollywood stars and great game designers and game programmers. We won a bunch of prizes, and we learned a hell of a lot. Then I became a consultant, and I became head of IP development at Nordisk Film Games, which is a Scandinavian media conglomerate. And The brief for me there was, how do we take these games that we've invested in, I think we invested about $140 million, how do we take them and turn them into something that lasts? And that is really the challenge with IP in games. It's how do you take something that has a very short life and give it a longer life, give it the ability to reach further. And the place we started was really to look at top-selling games. So what is it they all have in common? Well, you can break it down like this. On the one hand, they have a brand, which means that they're instantly recognizable. And you can see them in the Steam store or in a shop window or whatever. And you can immediately see, oh, this game is about that. I recognize it. I know the logo. I know the characters and so on. And I know the emotions that are being communicated to me. And I know if that's what I want. So that's one side of it. That's the brand. The other side of it that all the top-selling games had was an IP. So if you look at the hit lists, pretty much all the top-selling games are parts of series or some kind of well-known property. And that, of course, is because we like things we already know. But it's also because what works is the core elements of the IPs. The characters, the stories, and so on. And the recognizability. So how do you get there? Well, at the most fundamental level, what the AAAs are doing is they're actually consciously building strategies and pursuing them. So it's not just about building a brand or making whatever game it is. It's a conscious decision to go to map out the competitive landscape, to figure out the long-term goals for the company. Where do we want to go? What do we want to be world champions at? How are we going to get better and better from game to game? They look at positioning. So how do you place your game in the market so that it's recognizable? You know which genre it is. But it also stands out enough that people don't mistake it for something else and they know that it's unique and so on. And then they target the emotions. So both in the IP and in the brand, they're consciously thinking about which emotions are we communicating to the user, which emotions are we bringing the player through, and is that something this target audience enjoys? And of course, you can be more or less deliberate in that, depending on where you are on the scale. Are you an artist or is this a commercial company? But if you're an artist, you still need to brand it, you still need to get it out there in the market, and then these things come into play, even if you don't use them while you're creating the game. And if your main focus is building a company, then these things should be in focus both when you're building the game and when you're putting it in the market. So this is number one. Number two is that crafting emotion, making a story, making a character, also making a key visual for your brand is a professional skill. These are professional skills. They're not just, you know, your concept artist doing it or somebody who's played a lot of role-playing games writing the story because he used to do it well in the cellar. To make these things really work and stick and last and appeal, you need to work with them professionally. So to make something unique, whether it's the key visual or it's the main character in the IP or the storyline, you need to understand the structures of marketing positioning on the one hand and of building stories and characters on the other. You need to make it relatable so that the people who you see as your audience will recognize themselves, or at least they will recognize emotions that they know. And you need to have it dramatically structured. So a story is not just a bunch of stuff happening. It is a carefully built series of emotions that builds towards some kind of satisfying climax. So that really demands a professional. And then it needs to be durable, which basically means it has to last. If you're telling a story, it needs to be tellable more than once. If you look at Spider-Man, it's pretty much the same story every time we see a Spider-Man movie or a Spider-Man game. I know they're different, they're very different, but it's also always the same cycle of, you know, with great power comes great responsibility and all that. And it's the same every time. So in that way, it's very durable. It's not just a random bunch of emotions fired off every time. And that brings us to the third and last of these sort of initial building blocks, which is that it is specialist executed. And that means that, as I said before, the person who designs and directs the key visual for your brand, or the person who writes your script for the IP, these are people who pretty much don't do very much else. This is their specialty. I see a lot of game developers where the concept art on their game, the poster, the Steam store key art, is just a piece of concept art. And to be honest, it's just not good enough because it's not communicating the unique selling points of the game. It's not talking directly to the users most likely to enjoy it. And often it's simply communicating to people who already know the game. And that's a big mistake. So when it comes to these things, my advice is to bring in specialists. Even if they're not very experienced specialists because you're still building a game. There's still a huge difference between, oh, somebody knocked out a story over the weekend, or somebody who really lives and breathes for stories. So if we take these two things, and I keep talking about, on the one hand, bringing it to the market, on the other hand, building the brand. So, on the other hand, building the story and the product. So what's the difference between brand and IP? Well, the brand is how you communicate what you've built to the market. So it's the trailer, it's the logo, it's the key visual. It should be, rooted in the artistic intent of the game, but it should be professionally designed to hook people in seconds, and it should be very recognizable. We'll come back to that in a moment. And then there's the IP, which is really kind of the ownable part of the experience. And you can't really own gameplay, but what you can own is a specific character design and specific actions that are associated with that character. So if you think of the Hitman, it's tough to protect a guy in a suit, but if it's a bald man in a suit with a logo on the back of his neck and or silver silenced handguns, then it does become protectable because it becomes unique. So the difference here is that the IP is the protectable part of the experience you're making, and of course all the associations that go with it. And the brand is how you communicate that to the market. And the trick to learn, of course, is that these are not found. These are built. And that's what the AAAs do. And what the indies should also do. So that brings us to how. So if we start with the brand here, obviously when you're communicating your experience to the market, this is the goal, right? You want everybody to get what you're saying instantly. But of course, that's a little more difficult than it sounds. Because the trick, of course, is that nobody can see inside our dreams. And when we've spent 3, 4, 5 years with the game, we know it so well that the imagery we use to communicate it to the world is wrong. Because we're communicating to ourselves and our friends, and we've all been talking about this game forever. So what you need to do is you need to bring in externals of some kind who are only thinking about how to get the audience to feel what you feel. And that's a very different thing. And if you can do that, and if you can build it so that it has certain elements that you can repeat on all your ads or all your customer-facing visuals and sound and logos and so on, then you're beginning to have a brand. And then you're beginning to have something that people recognize, even if they don't click on it. And that's a big thing, because every time you're showing an ad, it's an opportunity for somebody to just experience what you're talking about. And if your ads all look different, then people are not accumulating that recognition. They're just seeing different stuff. So you really need to build something that can be repeated. And then, of course, it's strategically positioned. So what the brand should do is it should take your artistic intent. The people you hire to make your brand should get to know what you want to say, what you're trying to do with this game. And then they should figure out how to communicate that in the most effective way to the biggest possible audience. That's what good branding and advertising does. And here's an example that I worked with my colleagues in Leverage, which is Heroes and Generals. And when we came in, the ads for the game looked like this. This is a massively multiplayer shooter with 3 factions, World War II. And when you look at these ads, I mean, you can't even see it's the same game. So you're really not building that recognition at all. And when we were finished with it, it looked like this. So At this point, you have a recognizable logo, you have the 3 factions, you have a very clear visual schema with the explosion and the World War II at the same time. So there's a lot of things here that can be repeated. And what we also did was we built a brand manual. So the developer themselves were able to keep on making new assets, but doing advertising assets, but doing it within the brand that was built. So that each time they did a new campaign or a special offer or something, they're also building that brand recognition. And of course, the key visual was built to stack and be chopped up and so on, so that it doesn't become destroyed for different advertising formats. It can go vertical, like you see here on the right, or it can become a poster or whatever. And in this case, it was specifically built so that they could later launch different scenarios, different themes. They could do World War II, they could do Crusades, they could do Modern Warfare or whatever. And the brand was also built for that. So you could actually bring the brand recognition from one game to the next. So that was the brand part. Now comes the part that I personally enjoy, which is the IP building. So how do you build a lasting IP? The trick with IPs and the reason that they're so valuable is that we prefer things we already have an emotional relationship with. This is what friends are, right? It's easier to talk to somebody whom you've already gotten to know than it is to talk to somebody you don't know. And it's the same when you go into a bookstore or a game store or whatever. There's a real tendency to pick up stuff that you already know and look at that. And if you personally don't feel like that, you have to think about whether you're typical. The truth is, nobody's typical, but there's a bigger audience and there's the small indie avant-garde audience. And the indie avant-garde audience really likes new stuff, but there's not really that many of them. So if you want to build a sustainable company, you have to think beyond the indie avant-garde art house audience. You have to think, how do we reach a bigger audience? And if you build an IP right, then you're able to make a series of games, because just like Hitman, people are recognizing the character and the world and the gameplay, and they want more of that. They want something new, but they also now have a trust in that. And this is kind of the same thing with friends again. You look into a crowd and you will pick out your friends first. There's little doubt about it. We prefer things that we already have a relationship with. And if it really works, then you get to the point that we've seen recently with The Witcher or Sonic or Pikachu, which is that suddenly it can move on to other media. And I promise you, after things like The Witcher, the investors and the publishers are all looking for the next property that can do that. That cannot just become one hit game, but it can become a series of games, and ultimately it can move into other media. If you're not thinking like that when you're pitching an investor or a publisher, you're really only pitching half a game or half a property. You're actually only pitching this first gamble. What you should be pitching is the first installment in something much bigger that can become much larger. The important thing about IP is that it is not the same as awareness. It's not enough that people know of it, because not everything can move into other media. An IP is the artistic part that can be protected. So just as I spoke of with the Hitman, where you can protect that specific character, and you can do the same with Sonic, and you can do the same with Super Mario, this is what you can protect. You can protect the visual designs of the characters and your spaceships and so on. So here are the core components. Number one, you need a consistent artistic intent. You need a repeatable emotional journey, a universe built to last, a professionalized story development, and an ownable character. So consistent artistic intent is simple. At least it sounds simple. You need to have a clear vision of what you want to do, and you need it to be consistent across the game and across the series. A repeatable emotional journey means that the core elements of the story can be done again. And I mentioned Spider-Man earlier. Think about Harry Potter. It's 7 books about bullying, right? Every book Harry comes to the school, he gets bullied, he works hard, he figures out who he can trust, he solves the mystery, and he makes it. That's the basic structure that is repeated every time in each of these 7 books. And with Spider-Man, it's always the same constellation of, you know, his boss at work, his Auntie May, and some girlfriend, and then some, you know, almost random supervillain of the day. So it's the same story being told again and again. With Lara Croft, she is always looking for her father in the ruins. So there is this thing about IPs that the successful ones have found a kind of universal feeling that they've tapped into and made their own, and then they can repeat it again and again. Of course, all that is backed up with the branding and so on, so that it's pushed out. But it means that it's almost like they own an emotion, and it's difficult to challenge that. There's not a lot of other wizard properties out there, just as there are not a lot of other Hitman properties out there, because these IPs basically own that, and it's very expensive and risky to attack it. So a second element that you need is that you need a universe that's built to last. And books and movies are doing this and have been doing this for a long time. Games are getting there. And if you think about it, it's because the universe is almost like the stage on which multiple stories or game experiences have to be able to unfold. So it has to be big enough for you to be able to make more stories to put in it. And, you know, I like to use The Hobbit as an example because it's a good example of this. It's just not too late if you've already done one. Because with The Hobbit, Tolkien had done it. And then he realized he wanted to do something bigger with deeper emotions and for a more adult audience. So when he wrote Lord of the Rings, he put The Hobbit in a corner of this bigger world. So what had happened in the first book, The Hobbit, was now somewhere in a small part of the map that the whole of the Lord of the Rings saga played out on. And then, of course, in what I call phase 3 here, he started expanding even more. And then he made a mythology and so on, and all kinds of things, which made the universe around the Lord of the Rings even bigger. So the universe is really a way to make almost like a playing field for multiple episodes and stories. Star Wars, of course, is world champ at this, or was. And you can even see, for example, Rogue One, suddenly they're slotting in a new experience between the other experiences because the universe is consistent and it's big enough. This is somebody trying to encompass Marvel's cinematic universe, which is a little complicated. Not sure I would recommend trying to reverse engineer this. They did have, you know, 50 years of comic book storylines to play with, so it's almost like cheating. But they did a good job, you have to say. So where do you start in building a universe? Well, you start with a backstory. And you start with the mythology of the gods or the science or whatever. How did it all come to happen? What are the rules of this universe? What's the backstory that explains how we got here? And you start building a world Bible, which you of course will revise along the way, but which you also build so that it's big enough that the users never reach the edges. They never stop finding enough new things to explore. And then there's the professionalized story development. And I think this really comes down to taking your IP seriously. And I do see quite a few indie game developers who don't take the IP seriously. They take the technology seriously, they take the gameplay design seriously, they take the graphics enormously seriously. But the story is just whatever was on TV last night, or, you know, one of our friends just wrote a quick storyline. My message in this is that the story, characters, and world assets really need to be planned, iterated, and built just like the graphics and the code and the game design. Because if you're not doing that, if you're not taking it seriously, then you can be pretty sure the results are going to be not serious. And the truth is that emotional stories are quite intricate constructions. So, just a minute. If you think of a story, it's almost like a clock. It's full of an old-fashioned clock, which is full of cogs that are interlocking. So the fact that this character meets that character interlocks with the cog about the other character, which interlocks with the ending you want, and so on. And what happens a lot in game developers is that the person writing the story gets crushed between the tech department and the combat department and the game design department, and this happens on a daily basis. And the writer is not a partner, so he kind of gets crushed and gets overruled and so on. And other people are being paid more, so they can just say, I've got a better rate. And the result of that is that the story, which might have been pretty good at the start, is completely ruined by the time the game finished, because these cogs have been pulled out and replaced with monkeys or plastic octopuses or whatever. And it just means that there is no story by the time you get to the end. So you really need to take the story construction quite seriously and have somebody on the team whose job it is to protect the story construction while all the other things are being developed. And that's a challenge. Finally, you need an ownable character. And I can't state enough how important this is. All the major IPs are character-based. And when I say IP, I mean something that can move from one media to another. And you're not going, and when you talk about other media than games, you're quickly going to be talking about maybe books, but you're also going to be talking about movies and TV. That's where the big value is, because then you can start selling merchandise. So whether you like merchandise or not, if you want to get financed on the idea that this is going to be turned into an IP one day, you need a character. And the character has to be unique enough to be different, and it has to be ownable. And when I say ownable, I mean that if somebody copies it, the lawyers have to be able to stop them. And they can only do that if your character is visually unique enough to be protectable. But of course, just making it different is not going to be enough. You also need it to be emotional and relatable. And what I mean by that is that when I think of Harry Potter and the things he's gone through, I can relate to that idea of bullying. Whether I'm a bully or somebody who has been bullied or just somebody who knows somebody who's been bullied, those are recognizable emotions. And the same with Spider-Man, you know, fighting to do what he wants to do or needs to do while trying to maintain family and job and girlfriends and so on. Those are also relatable emotions. Even if you're a child, you can see your parents fighting with that struggle. So this character, I would argue, is the central piece of the IP. And if you're not building a character, and if you're not making that character unique enough, then you're really not building an IP. And if your game has become a success and there's no character, it's probably too late. It's very difficult to convince your core fans that they should now accept a character if you haven't put one in there yet. And don't tell me, please, that your character is impossible because in your game people design their own characters. Just look at Bloodborne. Nobody's character looks the same in Bloodborne, but everybody knows how the Bloodborne guy looks. And that's actually where the IP and the brand are tying together in that particular game, in that the IP or the brand is representing the IP, but it's also building the IP because they put the character in there. So there are, of course, some choices that you can make, and there are different things that are flexible, but you will need these things. And that's it. My message is that the IP and the brand are the core of your business, if you're thinking long term. Because the longer time people spend with it, either playing the game or just looking at the ads or the community or whatever, the more value you accumulate. It's almost like a battery that starts filling up. But you need to have something recognizable, something relatable, and something unique. Yeah, so your passion will not suspend the laws of business. Please don't think of your brand as somebody else's problem. And please don't treat your worlds and your characters and your stories as if they were fluff. Because one day, the main value of your company will be there. Thank you.